Hello, everyone. Um, let's get started. My name is Arta Moini. I am the Director of Research here at the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy. Uh, the for Peace and Diplomacy is a North American foreign affairs think tank, and we are dedicated to diplomacy, promoting free conversations and exchange of ideas, as well as military restraint and holistic approaches and realistic approaches to U.S. foreign policy that puts national interest first and moves away from ideology and starlight idealism. We are here at the tailgate of what is a historic um, week, and no matter how we want to look at the election results, the one issue that's clear is that the American people have been clear that they want change and they don't want business as usual. What is also clear is that a global interventionism and hawkish foreign policy has been rejected at the polls, and we have to think through what that would mean. Um, on that note, one of the biggest symbols of American, what some pro or against would call the American empire, is NATO. And the future of NATO is both the cause of trepidation uh, for some in the Trump administration, as well as European allies and partners, as well as others around the world. So the question is, what is going to be the future with NATO, especially with the incoming Trump administration? So today's panel is specially scheduled to think through the question of the future of NATO, as well as what the incoming Trump administration might do and how it might impact the future of NATO, whether it is just to get the Europeans to pay more of their share, or is it more fundamental to change the structure and the permanence of NATO? And in any case, we have an amazing panel for you today. And my colleague, Dominic Sansone, he is the Next Generation Washington Fellow here with us at IPD America. And I am glad that he will moderate this panel for us. So I will just, without further ado, hand it over to Dom to introduce the panelists and we go from there. Thank you.
Thank you, Arta. Yeah, as Arta said, my name is Dominic Sansone. I'm really very excited and honored to get to host this webinar with such distinguished guests at this really historic and monumental moment, met with hope by a lot, apprehension by others. So yeah, I'd like to introduce the guests and then we'll get going. So we have Dr. Barry Posen, who's the Ford International Professor of Political Science at MIT, Jeremy Shapiro, who's the Research Director at the European Council on Foreign Relations, Dr. Monica Gabriela Bartasovich, I think I got that right, Associate Professor at the Arctic University of Norway, and Dr. Christopher Mott, who's a Washington Fellow here at the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy. So going off of what Arta said, the webinar is Today Ukraine, Tomorrow the World, NATO as the Lynchpin of the American Empire. So looking at that as that kind of transition, hopefully, of NATO from something like an ideological institution to maybe taking on a different role in a shifting geopolitical environment, particularly in regard to the rise of multipolarity, whether NATO will be able to adjust if it will continue to be relevant, or if other types of regional organizations will have to rise up in its place as it becomes less relevant. So we've had a recent piece at IPD by Dr. Christopher Mott here called NATO, the Guardrail of Globalism, which discusses this. And whether or not you agree with the thesis, I think everybody has to admit that it is an exceptional title. So starting off, I'd like to hand it over to Chris and let him expand upon that a little bit before we go to our other panelists.
Right. Thanks, Dominic. The point of the piece was to basically state that NATO once had a clearly defined purpose and a clearly defined geography. And it was very much meant to be defensive, and it was meant to be rooted in the North Atlantic and Europe, Western and Central Europe specifically. And then at the end of the Cold War, this kind of very what we might call localized specialty was gradually stripped away, not just through eastward expansion, but also through a kind of pivot to a more ideological conception of what the alliance is. So we went from a pragmatic anti-Soviet. It's very debatable if the Soviet Union ever had expansionistic designs in Europe, of course, but no one knew that at the time, so it was perfectly logical. You had many of the people state outright its practical goals, from its first General Secretary, Lord Ismay, who said, keep the Americans in, Russians out, Germans down. Very specific, very focused. Starting in the 1990s, you have this pivot towards expansionism, both in terms of its self-perception as a kind of a political engineering project, and also as a goal in itself. So you have NATO forces, even if not officially under the alliance, being deployed in conjunction in the Yugoslav wars. Eventually, in the War on Terror, Article 5, the Defense Clause, attack on one is an attack on all, is invoked in 9/11. And then you have NATO forces effectively deployed to Afghanistan. This rapidly goes from a counterterrorism mission into a nation building mission, which was not at all under the perimeters of Article 5 whatsoever. And then, of course, you have, although this is not, I don't believe, officially a NATO operation, you have many NATO countries working together to topple the government in Libya in 2011. None of these are defensive, and they're moving ever outwards, away from the kind of core North Atlantic region. So it posed me, in the piece we have at the IPD website, it posed me to ask the question, is this kind of the tip of the spear for a kind of attempt to make a values-based American hegemony alliance that really straddles the world? And if that is the case, what are the dangers of that? And I personally think that the dangers of trying to globalize every region and every conflict are manifest. I think you can see them in the pre-nuclear age, in the July crisis of 1914, where a local problem can become a global problem without any safeguards whatsoever. And you can absolutely see that now in the post-nuclear age, why that might be an issue. And when you have NATO running joint exercises within like the South China Sea, when you've got talks to have Japan play a greater role in the alliance, the question just arises, like, is this truly global? And then what is its justification? And then the counterpoint to that, which is kind of like my final argument of the piece, is that as this grows, the national interest of many of the countries gets more muddied because there is no longer a specific geographic or kind of hyper-focused mission. And so everyone's interest gets all jumbled up. The further the alliance grows, the more you're going to see division within the alliance, and the more likely you're going to see outside people maybe provoking something that other people might not want to join, right? Like, why should Germany be involved in the South China Sea? Why should Japan be involved in Europe? And this kind of leads to the idea that maybe some of the people who are at higher up in this alliance now, they've gone now over a generation without a proper peer competitor on the borders of the alliance. Are they thinking at all about like the dangers of having a truly global permanent alliance network, especially one that is increasingly focused outside of its supposedly defensive bounds? Like, Ukraine is not a NATO member, and yet the Ukraine war is the enormous all-consuming thing of NATO. Okay, well, it's adjacent to some NATO members, so you can kind of see that point. But what if this then expands to Middle Eastern countries? What if this then grows into relations with the Eastern Asian countries? It's very odd to me, because I think under conditions of multipolarity, what you're seeing is, proportionally speaking, more and more, and we've done a lot of research and work on this at IPD. We have our Middle Powers project. We don't see a new Cold War. I think I can speak for us as an institution. We see a rise of a variety of powers. There is no global hegemony. And so an attempt to kind of shore up a global hegemony when there are all these regionalized, localized powers might be a mistake, particularly when those regionalized, localized powers, because they are focused on their core interests and their core regions, seem to be operating with an advantage over countries that perhaps have overexpanded alliance networks. And so they can more effectively wield power politics in their specific regions than a kind of distant, ever expanding alliance network whose logistics are growing ever longer and who is made up of mostly post industrial countries who simply cannot make the arms and ammunition as of now that some other countries do. So the question of national interest becomes, I think, complicated by the attempt to make a global alliance network. And it also muddies the waters of the fact that alliances, as we know, are not permanent mergers. They're usually temporary. There's very few examples of something like the Anglo-Portuguese alliance that lasts for centuries, and very many examples of shorter term things. So the bigger you grow, the more internal contradictions emerge. Meanwhile, outside of the alliance, I think people, many rival middle powers, perhaps rival superpowers like China, have a much more pragmatic concept and are much more willing to focus on different regions in different ways rather than to globalize their grand strategy. I would say that this might give them an advantage. That's basically the core points of the paper.
Thank you so much, Chris. Excellent. If we could go to Barry, I'd like to hear what you think on the topic as well, and maybe a response to Chris as well, if that's acceptable.
Right. Hopefully I got rid of that vibration. I mean, did I? Is the vibration you heard gone?
Oh, yeah.
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah, good. I closed the window. So since this is a short talk, I won't spend a lot of time foreshadowing or anything. I'll just make some observations. In 2003, I was living in Brussels studying the European Union security and defense policy. And I went to a meeting at the decrepit old NATO headquarters, now closed. And it was full of, NATO luminaries wringing their hands about NATO's future and what was going to happen and how bad everything was going to be. And somebody from the NATO, I guess, public information department, public relations, if you will, made the following point, and it was very simple. When he says, just remember, NATO is a good brand, right? And as you know from the commercial world, lots of brands don't die. They get recycled, they get reused. Ultimately, they go away. Some of the brands from my youth are finally gone, but brands are sticky. And NATO's utility as a good brand did a lot of work in those days. I just caricaturing it, I think US elites wanted to keep NATO alive as a stepping stone to other things. They were desperate to avoid what my friend Harvey Sapolsky used to call a Cold War victory parade, bring the troops home and say that we've done our international mission. The establishment, foreign policy establishment, was desperate to keep this from happening, and NATO was in many ways the best brand to use to sustain a non or anti or defense against the feared dragon of isolationism. So NATO was useful in that regard, and you could package up projects as NATO projects, and they worked better. And I think they were easier to sell. I mean, and so you had, if you could say it was a NATO thing, it was easier to keep some troops abroad, easier to keep a mission abroad, easier to make arguments about going other places. If you could say that NATO was going along, because Americans remembered, oh, NATO, good alliance. If they're along, it sounds better, right? And if we have allies, that means we're doing less, and we have approval. So I think it was all jumbled together in a kind of, I don't know what we call it, a kind of a cake or a stew that basically would say that, NATO has utility for many other things in a political sense for the United States. For the American establishment in the post-Cold War world, when fear of isolationism was so great. And of course, the European allies wanted to keep it alive as an insurance policy because they've lived in that part of the world for centuries, and something always goes wrong. And the old joke about Americans in, Germans down, Russians out. Maybe that the power of all that recedes a bit, but it doesn't go away entirely if you're European, and it's a pretty good deal for them, right? So in exchange for keeping the Americans around at an insurance policy, you mill about smartly a little bit, show up for a few things. I would also say one other thing, which is European foreign policy and defense establishments not entirely naive themselves. They wanted to keep some piece of a capability. And I think they had a easier time selling that piece of the capability if it was wrapped up in NATO and a series of obligations and an enduring commitment to the United States. than it would have been otherwise. So I think they also saw their own interests, right? And this was pretty cheap until the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022. I think in many ways the attraction as a good brand is gone. It was alluded. One of the reasons why we're sort of in a bit mood here is because it seems like maybe the brand had no utility at all at the recent election. There are people who are adept at torturing public opinion polls in the United States into producing some sort of affirmative case for NATO. Americans like it or prefer it or support it or whatever. But I don't really believe those polls anymore. I think they're punched up by the way the questions are asked. And as far as the brand is concerned, I think the brand is in decline. My joke here is, who remembers Life magazine? I remember Life magazine as a magazine most people don't. Now, I think the brand works better in Europe, if only because Vladimir Putin has simplified NATO's purpose back in the first instance to external defense against the Russians. But if the Americans don't continue to hold up their end, which is to make it inexpensive to be, defensive, I think the brand may fade in Europe as well. Be that as it may, Europe needs some sort of security institution to manage a bumptious Russia and to manage ferment and trouble in North Africa and the Middle East. You go back to that first European Union security strategy document where they talked about wanting a ring of well-governed states, kind of a bit of liberal sphere of interest kind of thinking there in those early days. So there's a problem, and they need some way to manage it. Now, NATO might be the institution to manage it, even if the U.S. slowly reduces its commitment. NATO is, aside from a flag and an office building, it's an organization and it does stuff. It knows how to do stuff. It has a command structure. It has doctrines. It has tactics, techniques, and procedures, standardization agreements, of which there are millions. So a simple way for Europe to deal with its problems organizationally would be to, even if the Americans are kind of hollowing out their commitment, keep the shell alive. And it goes back to being NATO, right? And not Globo or whatever we try to turn it into. Or it could be the European Union, which has a high hill to climb, but has been preparing, stage left, doing little things to be ready to accept the inheritance if it has to accept it. Not that anyone really wants it, but they've kind of got ready for it. Maybe the two could work together in some way. They work together better now than they once did. But I think Europeans, defense establishments and foreign policy establishments are going to try and postpone this for as long as possible. NATO is a great thing for them. The American guarantee is a great thing for them. Not only is it, in some sense, reduce their defense burden in a dollar sense, it reduces the burden of defense in their polities and societies. They don't have to have a new argument about conscription, or maybe they should, but they don't. And most of all, they don't have to have a dispute about who makes most of the rules in the coalition that comes after NATO, because the natural tendency is going to be for the biggest powers to have the biggest say. But even the big powers don't agree among themselves which one should have the bigger say, and the little ones don't like any of them. And they'd all prefer to have the Americans stay. So what I'm saying is that NATO is sticky. There's lots of reasons why people want to keep it alive, and they're going to try and keep it alive as best they can. I think Germany is kind of exhibit A. Zeitenwende seems to be petering out. If you look at the big commitments they made to start, they were two big commitments that were really made to make the Americans happy as much as to solve any problem. Arrow was really buying a lobby in the United States, the Arrow air defense system. It's not really right in any sense for Germany. It was engineered for a much smaller piece of real estate. But, it buys you into a whole, the Israel lobby, the defense lobby, and then the other is the F-35, which again buys you into the American defense lobby and also buys you into this little nuclear cult in NATO, because the F-35 is really the German nuclear force. That's what it's for. It's not really for anything else. It's to make good on their future commitment to tactical nuclear weapons. This is all about throwing your arms around NATO, throwing your arms around the Americans, trying to make sure that this is the outcome. I think it's a high risk kind of strategy. They think it's a low risk strategy, or they wouldn't be doing it. So it's either incredibly clever because they're pretty sure it's going to work, or it's incredibly naive because they're pretty sure it's going to work, right? So one or the other. And then finally, and I'll be done here. So the other way the Europeans are trying to hold America's interest is what was mentioned earlier about going global in the Pacific and all the rest of it. But the material facts of the case are that Europe has not much military power to commit to the Pacific. They can do things symbolically that make the Americans feel good, make other people feel good, but it's a long ride to the Pacific, and anything they do in the Pacific costs vastly more in terms of sort of how much mileage it puts on the aircraft, and how much mileage it puts on the ship, and how much time it diverts the troops. And in the end, you have a couple of small packets of things out in the Pacific. They're not going to matter that much militarily. It just makes the Americans feel good. Maybe it makes some of the Asians feel good. And maybe that's enough. I mean, I believe their involvement in this specific thing is part of, again, this larger, strategies to make the Americans happy and hold them in. The problem here is that I think the Americans actually want something else, at least as much as they want symbolic commitments of military power, and that's really hard commitments to the American economic campaign against China. And I think the Biden administration is already well on to that project. And I think that project would have continued had there been another Democratic administration. I'm guessing it's going to intensify under Trump, but it'll probably be kind of weird, which is like Trump will be punishing the Chinese today and trying to negotiate with them deals tomorrow. He won't be unhappy about either including or excluding Europeans from those deals as it pleases him. But the message that's going to come to the Europeans is that when we say don't trade, don't sell any IT related device, whether it's a manufacturing device or software or whatever, subcomponents, don't sell them to China, don't share the technology, don't do this, don't do that. We're serious. We want this in our hands. And whether or not that trade is one that Europeans will be willing to make on an open-ended basis, added to the caprice with which the demands are now going to be made, I think is an open question. This could be quite problematically for NATO, and it raises the cost of being in the alliance. And the question is, can that be hidden from European publics? I mean, the German government seems to be having its own problems right now because people are unhappy with the economy, and the Germans are out of ideas for how to be a high productivity, high GDP per capita country in a world where they don't really control the technology, the moment IT, and the things they're good at, which is helping developing economies develop. The Americans are frowning upon in the case of the Chinese. I think Germany hopes that India will be their next move. Maybe it'll work, maybe it won't. But this is going to be an open sore. And I guess the final thing we all understand is that the U.S. establishment seems to believe that the problem of containing China and managing Iran and North Korea is a big problem, military problem in its own right. Managing Russia adds to it. The hawks are out demanding gigantic but unspecified increases in what's already $1 trillion defense budget. Trump has a lot of projects, doesn't want to raise taxes, a lot of borrowing involved. Are we just going to keep putting it all on the MasterCard to make good on our idea that NATO is a great thing and we should do whatever it takes to keep it alive? Or are we going to see the Americans, especially this administration, scratching their heads and saying, you guys are rich, why don't you hold up your end? Which is another possible source of trouble. With that, I'll stop.
Right. Thank you so much, Barry. That was excellent. All right, we'll go up to see what the view is like from Norway with Monica.
Thank you. I guess our answer to the leading question, whether or not NATO is a linchpin, or at least a critical instrument in terms of furthering the global American empire, is positive. The only difference that we have is whether that instrument is a stick or a carrot. And we've had views for both and arguments for both. Now, my answer to this is going to be it's neither. And what it is an addictive, at least from the European perspective. In the best case, it's a vodka. In a worst case scenario, it's very akin to fentanyl. And I'm sure that I don't have to explain to American public what that means for the end user. And why would I say that? Let me explain. This week, my research group organized its annual event that was a conference, international, and then this year we met under the theme of emergent threats. And basically, it doesn't matter which kind of threats we discussed. The answer to all those issues on the horizon, potential, imagined, perhaps real, was but NATO. And it's absolutely astounding when you listen to these conversations from the sideways and you think that NATO is a panacea to absolutely everything, starting with Ukraine, but also with potential any sort of geopolitical trouble that could happen on this side of the globe. So basically a magic potion that answers to everything. If you wanted to write another Harry Potter book, you could write it Harry Potter and NATO. And this is astounding, again, because it just tells you how much the Europeans are addicted to this sense of absolute safety provided by NATO, in this sense or absolute trust that it can deliver what it has never been really checked to deliver. Now, if you ask me if NATO is deterrent, I would be very hesitant to say whether or not that is the case. But if you ask me whether or not NATO is a feel-good type of self-deluding propaganda, I would say so. And now coming back to how effective an instrument of geopolitical shenanigans that is, it is even more effective than carrots, and it's even more effective than sticks, because basically you don't have to do anything. It does its own work. Barry said it's a good brand. It's more than a brand, Barry, in a sense. It really is something that Europeans self-perpetuate. They don't need to be encouraged by the Americans. Now, obviously, this week's election mean a lot of changes, and now Europeans are holding breaths. And we all are asking, what does it mean? Oh dear, what is he going to do? Is he going to withdraw the horror? Or is he going to do what he said last time? You pay up, darlings, for the security promises that NATO brings, because there are no divisions in NATO. The only divisions in NATO is the US and the rest. Let's be brutally honest about it. When you look at military capabilities in Europe, let me just quote the new armaments commissioner in the EU. That's I'm quoting this after Financial Times. He said this week that air and missile defense systems will cost Europe 500 billion euros. And what does it mean? In normal numbers, it means 50% more than EU countries spend on defense annually. So when you think about European strategic sovereignty, please do take these numbers into consideration. And as to let the most affluent pay up, you also need to take into consideration that in terms of operational capacity, obviously, NATO was only half-heartedly tried, and only in terms of Schrödinger war that Ukraine war is. It is a war. It is a NATO war, and it isn't a NATO war at the same time. So when you think about shell production and defense production, did you gentlemen check what do we have to pay for energy in Europe? I'm not speaking about Norway, thank God for our oil, obviously, but please do check UK and Germany. Have you heard about industries closing down? So in a sense, again, when I'm saying that NATO is like vodka and or even more addictive drug, this is what I mean. Strategic sovereignty is impossible for Europe at this stage. Even if you read through the European compass, the strategic compass that was released just on the cusp of the outbreak of war, it is obvious that ambitions are huge, but means of delivery are none. So really NATO is the only thing that is left in terms of the dreams about not only some sort of American empire, but about this rules-based order that Christopher started with. And the peace dividend was obviously entirely consumed on welfare states and on other non-essential spendings. It's going to be very difficult for Europe to actually reverse their priority in terms of budget spending that only grows. So with this in mind, I wanted to say that I still am very impressed with how effective NATO was for all its inactivity, let's call it, in Europe. I remember when Poland, which is the country I'm from, was about to join NATO for the first time, and the Russians said no. And I was a very young girl back then. I couldn't understand for the whole world, why would another country prevent my sovereign, at least on paper, country to join something that would make us safe. Now we have this history repeating, but as a farce again. And it also speaks something about this arc of certain geopolitical period that definitely is drawing to a close. With this, I would be very curious to hear your thoughts on these comments. Thank you.
That was excellent, Monica. Thank you so much. Really appreciate that. All right, I'd like to hear from Jeremy now, please.
Thank you. I feel like most of what I wanted to say has been said. So I'll try not to repeat the other presentations, but I guess, and maybe highlight a little bit more the differences or maybe explore them because I'm not sure whether they are differences. But I guess a lot of the way that NATO was being discussed in most of the previous presentations was troubling to me because it felt as if NATO had this sort of free-flowing institutional existence outside of its member states and particularly outside of the United States. And I mean, it's true as Barry said that there is a headquarters and there's all of these regulations and things, but very fundamentally, NATO is the exchange that everybody has described. Basically, it's the Europeans get protection on the cheap, and the Americans get an instrument of global leadership. And NATO is the crown jewel, the best institutional expression of the U.S. effort at a system of alliances that supports U.S. global leadership, but it's only one of them. There are many other alliances, and the U.S. already has a global system of alliances that that are intended to support its leadership and historically have done a pretty good job of it. NATO, I think, is the single most important one, but it's only one. And so the question of whether, for example, NATO expands to Asia isn't really a very interesting one for the overall system or for the overall trade. It's an expression, as Barry said, of NATO's effort and the Europeans' effort to make sure that the Americans still see NATO as valuable. To me, the core question for the future of NATO is whether this trade continues to work. And that's, of course, and whether, the Europeans recognize, I guess, that they're on fentanyl. I don't know, I'd have gone with crack. But I mean, I've known a few crack addicts in my life. It's not good for them, but really they do like it quite a bit. And they can go for quite a long time. I would say maybe challenge the metaphor a little bit because I think that this has been very good for the Europeans. I think it has some of the disadvantages that you talked about, particularly in terms of infantilization, but it's been a very, very good 80-year run. And I can tell you that the vast majority of them want to keep it, and I certainly understand why. I think if I was in their situation, I would feel exactly the same way. And all of the German efforts that Barry described to keep it by buying planes and missile defense systems they don't need are, in some sense, a wise investment if it works. The real question is whether it will work. And there you get to the American side. And it is the American side which is bringing all of this into question. NATO has clearly found a new mission. It looks a lot like the old mission, so it's not a mission problem anymore. It was for a couple of generations. Um, and there, I mean, we've seen. I think this week has been very important in that discussion. If we were having this discussion on Monday, I think it would have been a very, very different discussion. Um, but the Biden administration and frankly the entire U.S. foreign policy community, basically, including the Republican part of it, has been very on board with this idea of U.S. global leadership supported by a global network of alliances, of which NATO is the crown jewel. And the Biden administration, even for its reluctance and to get involved in things in Europe, its early reluctance to get involved in things in Europe and the Middle East, was so much part of that consensus that when its leadership was challenged in Ukraine, it couldn't simply live its truth about the need to prioritize the Asia Pacific. It had to get re-involved first in Ukraine and second in Israel, Gaza, and they were frankly supported in that effort by, I think, the vast majority of the foreign policy community, the vast majority of the Republicans in Congress, and certainly pretty much everybody in the administration. But Donald Trump, for better and for worse, is not part of that consensus. And I think he really means it. And he really has, it's one of his few consistent positions, a very different approach to allies. He thinks that allies are essentially like your relatives who show up at your house and ask you to borrow money and then stay all day and use your pool. And he really thinks that America has gotten a sucker deal, and more importantly, his whole sort of outlook on international relations, on life, is about transactionalism. It isn't about the kind of diffuse trade, long-term trade, shadow of the future trade that an alliance, and particularly the NATO alliance, represents. And so I think it's very important that Europeans understand that this whole debate under the Trump administration about increased defense spending is a bit of a distraction, because it's just a lever by which the Trump administration can beat the Europeans. He's not actually interested in getting them to spend more per se. I mean, he's not against it, but it won't change his fundamental view of the alliance. And that's why you see that as they've approached 2%, now the Trump administration is saying, well, maybe it should be 3. I mean, at the end of the day, if they built the Americans an aircraft carrier and parked it off the coast of Mar-a-Lago and threw the keys onto the 18th green, he still wouldn't be satisfied, because it's not really about defense spending. It is about the fact that he's not interested in protecting them, and that's exactly what they want out of the alliance. So now the question is, and so I don't know. I mean, I feel like, given it's very perilous to predict the future of policy under a Trump administration. But I do feel like in a sort of Trump unleashed administration, which it seems like we're going to get, the idea that the American part of this bargain will continue, or that anyone in Moscow, in Beijing, in Berlin, or anywhere will believe that it's continuing, and therefore the deterrent value will be still strong, I think it's just not on. And this doesn't necessarily mean that the Americans leave NATO. I mean, NATO is after all, fundamentally, if you think about the trade I talked about, just the promise that the Americans will defend you. If nobody believes that promise, then NATO already doesn't exist. It's not really important whether there are still people buzzing around in the headquarters having meetings. And so it seems to me that that's what's happening. It's only been a few days, but I think that Europeans are, broadly speaking, aware of that. There is still sort of a rearguard action among many countries, well, a lot of countries, to try to hope that it's not true. But I think that they are, so there's a fair amount of denial, but I think that they are also, there is a a broad movement to also try to do something about it. And there we get into the problems that Monica already outlined, that they're not remotely ready to do anything about it, and that on a sort of best timeline, this is a 5 to 10 year project, and that assumes that they could actually find the sort of political consensus and will to even start it. I think, I think that Vladimir Putin has done a pretty good job of trying to get them to start it. Trump did an okay job in his first term. I think he'll do a better job. But I guess if I've learned anything about European politics, it's that just because something is necessary, it doesn't mean that it will happen. And I think that what we're going to be seeing is emerge in Europe over the next few years, assuming that Trump goes the way that I said he will, is a sort of post-American politics for the first time, in which they really have to confront these issues and figure out whether they have the sort of political consensus, whether they have the institutions, and whether they have the political will to devote the resources necessary to actually replace the American commitment to Europe. I don't know what the outcome of that is, but it's important to note that it's not necessary. It doesn't necessarily, if they fail to do that, it doesn't necessarily mean that Europe ceases to exist, but it does mean that the nature of their defenses are weak enough that they essentially become geopolitical bystanders, which is, I think, something you have. I guess that's kind of the best case, which is something you're sort of already seeing. That that Europe is really not playing at all in the Middle Eastern war. That is, kind of a lot nearer to them than it is to Beijing or to Washington. And they're not playing much of a role in the Ukraine war, and may well play a lesser role going forward. And that gets me to my final point, which is I think that the indicator of this for Europeans will be how the Trump administration handles the Ukraine war. And if they follow at all the president-elect's promises to basically wind that up effectively on Russian terms to create a sort of Yalta-type peace with the Ukrainians, I think that's something that could be accomplished. But if it is, it will be an unmistakable signal to the Europeans that there is no more American protection. And then it will at least be interesting to see how they respond, because I think the possibility of denial will be over.
Excellent. Thank you, Jeremy. So it seems that America has these fentanyl and or crack addicted relatives hanging out in their pool all day.
I prefer
And
crack.
crack or fentanyl, maybe both. But so it seems America, at least one prospect under the Trump administration, is that we're going to get these relatives out of the pool. We're going to slap them around, get them sober, and tell them that they need to get jobs. As Monica said, whether that's realistic in the immediate term, you look at something like industrial capacity and shell production, some of the domestic politics within European countries. I suppose I wanted to go to Chris, but I'd like to hear from everybody. What happens at that nexus there where ideology meets concrete fact? Europe is not currently able to put itself on its feet, but you have an American establishment, or that's very much committed, at least on paper, still to this transatlantic alliance. So, Chris, again, I wanted to go to you first, but how do you see that playing out, actually? Can these structural challenges be overcome to actually, initiate some type of real change, or do things just continue as they always have continued?
I think they absolutely can be overcome, but I think Monica's completely right to say that they cannot be overcome immediately. There's definitely going to be a time period, and if there isn't significant enough pressure put on policymakers to make changes, then that time period will drag and drag and drag because it's easier to go with the flow. So some degree of emergency needs to be inserted into it. But absolutely, I think that we are looking at a transitional period rather than a clean break with anything. The fact is, I think that this is just rooted in material reality. It's not even primarily a question of right or wrong or anything like that. It really is a question of straight up capacity. NATO was built in a time when the United States was half of the world's industrial output and over half of its economic output. It was very easy for it to provide security guarantees to whoever it wanted to. This is no longer true. The percentage of the world's economy is significantly less than it used to be, and the percentage of industrial output by the US is even less than that. And then, of course, you have many of these European countries that they have a maybe they're higher in global GDP than they were back then, but their industrial output is also much lower. So the reindustrialization is, of course, necessary. But it's going to have to be done on a case-by-case basis, and people are going to fixate on different industries when they do so, which kind of proves the point that I don't think this could be entirely globalized, right? Except for maybe the United States acting as a distant coordinator. But the fact of the matter is, it is objectively a multipolar world. This means that there will be not just differences in development models or redevelopment models, but also differences in political values, differences in political systems. This is how world history has functioned for 99.9% of world history. So this is not exactly a weird thing. We are leaving the weird period. We are re-entering the normal period. But I think the problem that we might have is certain people who have coasted from relative success to success on both sides of the Atlantic in policy elite circles don't are very disconnected from the world that had to build from the ashes and build these arrangements, and it's all just kind of become complacent inheritance in a way. So there is going to speed things up. You're going to have to be able to shake people who may in fact be true ideologues. And get them to acknowledge certain realities of the world, which require, I think, a more direct conception of the importance of infrastructure and industry, and much less focus on, shall we say, kind of nation building and or democratization projects. The world is a complicated place, as it always will be, and I think there are certain people that want to artificially simplify it. But the fact of the matter is, under conditions of multipolarity, multiple models are going to compete with other models in various regions, and you cannot just take a Washington consensus anymore to be the global standard. Especially under, and this I think ties to divergent interests with alliance members, right? The U.S. has become insanely addicted to sanctioning people all across the world. And I think this is a huge error because it has undermined many U.S. allies. It has caused people to look for alternative ways to trade with people. You need only look at Indian foreign policy towards Russia since the outbreak of the Ukraine war to see this in action. And people are going to look for alternatives if you force everyone to the same standard. And I think right now, if we want to pivot to a world where there is more decentralized responsibility and more capability for various nations that get along with each other, it has to be accepted that there needs to be more freedom for these countries to choose their international economic policies and arrangements with trade with other countries.
Great. Yeah, that makes me think, Barry, I'd like to hear what you think about that, if that seems possible, how that might unfold. And also on Jeremy's point, just about whether, this trade continues now, specifically with the United States, maybe, looking to make some significant changes. Back to your point as well about how Europe might try to postpone that through various things like getting involved or agreeing to aid the United States, perhaps in other parts of the world. If you think that is something that will really happen, and if it will, how that would actually look in actual international relations.
Well, we can't, as Jeremy said, making predictions at this moment. This is a bit sporting. We can't really tell, at least I can't. I'm not a Trump whisperer. I have no connection to the campaign, and even the folks who buzz around him who claim to be who media tells us are his foreign policy advisors. I don't see those people very often, so I don't really know what they're going to do. I don't know what would make them happy. What I think what we can say is that Trump really wants to see a bigger effort. right? He said that a lot. He wants to see a bigger effort. In other words, the joke, we keep making the same joke about the vodka and the pool and everything else, right? I mean, he wants to see people, sober up and get a job and pay their dues to the country club to use that pool, right? And that's sort of what he wants to see. And since he is transactional, there's lots of things, side payments that Europe can make to the Americans. And he is narcissistic. So there's lots of things you can do to make him feel good. So, European, this sounds like a contradiction in terms these days, but I'll use the word European statespersons, although they often style themselves as helpless idiots, I believe they are in fact very cagey. And I think that they, we have this strategy in international politics, different countries have tried buck passing. I think they are the most successful buck passers in world history. And it's not just because the Americans are the most eager and capable buck catcher in world history. It's partly because the Europeans are adept at holding up their end as buck passers. So I expect a full court press from the European statespersons to figure out what'll make them happy this time and how much leg can we show. Right. So there'll be a lot of hosannas and bowing in his direction and people showing up and kissing Henry VIII's ring. Right. There'll be a lot of that activity. And I think even though, we hear, it's so hard to find more money, I think you will see even more defense contracts let in the United States of America. If the Germans can buy 35 F-35s, they can buy 70. These are all gifts of votes to the Republican Party. These are all working people who are voting Republican, right? So you are giving the king lots of tangible benefits, right? And it's easier to let these contracts in the United States for reasons people say the European defense industry is somewhat sclerotic, and the parts of it that you could easily convert to war production are busy defeating Boeing. So why would you want to divert Airbus to making weapons when it's busy winning a victory over Boeing, right? So I think we're going to see a lot of that. The question we cannot answer is it going to work, right? But in the first instance, it's what I expect to see, right? So then the question is, what if it doesn't work? And when do you know? Right? When does Trump do or say things that are so transparently obvious that there's a light that goes on among European statespersons? I mean, the strategy isn't working, can't work. The American people don't care, won't support it, which I think is part of the backdrop here. When and how does such a light go on? And will they be ready to respond in some way in their own interest when the light goes on? And ready means putting a lot of institutions in place. It means letting some contracts at home. It means figuring out, how you would reorganize your own military. It means figuring out which infrastructure you're going to use to run military operations, a whole new one, or simply buy the keys to shape and Niver from the Americans and run it out of those buildings with European radios and phones. I mean, the question is, how ready can you be? How ready, for that moment, right? And again, very hard to know. We know that modern liberal politicians defer hard decisions for as long as they can. Europeans don't like having hard choices made among, policies that may affect one country or the other. So the tendency is going to be to postpone this. Now, I would say that they're lucky in one respect. Putin is just the perfect enemy. He's just bad enough and big enough to be a threat and just discombobulated enough that basically the Ukrainians, right, with the flotsam and jetsam that was in our basements, our military basements, were able to essentially slow the Russian advance to a crawl. And I suspect had they not frittered away their resources on various fantasies, they would still be doing a pretty good job of slowing the Russians to a crawl, right? So to me, this just puts the adversary in perspective. This idea that, the Soviet Union is waiting across the border, it's preposterous. The idea that Europeans can't find the resources to deal with Russia, it's preposterous. They don't want to, right? They just don't want to, for all the cost reasons we've discussed, right? And the question is, what would make them not want to, but feel that they have no choice?
Excellent, thank you. Yeah, so Monica, I'd like to hear your response to that as well, specifically about the buck passing. You had talked about some deindustrialization in Europe, obviously not Norway so much as you had said. As Barry pointed out, though, if the resources are there, perhaps it will take a minute to get to the point where they could sustain themselves somewhat. How do you see and I'd very much like to hear from Jeremy after about this same issue. How do you see that playing out regarding domestic politics in Europe? Do you see, uh, something like the current establishment losing a certain amount of power or adjusting or finding other ways to simply create the illusion that they are doing enough to keep that buck passing going, as Barry had touched upon? Or I'd like to hear what you have to say about that.
I think that the arrangement that Barry just presented would be perfect and would last in eternity, with, tributes being sent to placate the glorious Emperor Trump, if the game was only between Europe and the US. But NATO is not that game anymore. There are also external factors, as you mentioned. And of course, I'm not saying that Putin will invade, the Arctic. Someone said in the comments, the Arctic has not even been mentioned. But Putin will not do that. The question of NATO really lies in what is it worth, really? And we keep saying that or people in NATO do believe in NATO, and we keep repeating how good an instrument that is. So the moment of let's check that out is going to be the most interesting one, I guess. But the best analogy I find is that NATO at that moment is precisely like our fiat currencies. The moment that dollar was taken off the gold standard, it is based on trust that it is a good currency. But if you look at dollar value denominated in gold, you will see how much of value it lost over the years. And I wonder if not NATO, if it doesn't really follow the same trajectory as you would, in a sense that the moment where let's check the credibility is going to be the most interesting one, precisely because I really do not believe a full-scale invasion scenario. We were theorizing on that during the conference that I organized, and we were saying, so let's assume preposterously that we have North Koreans now apparently joining the war. Let's imagine that this North Korean detachment just enters into Finnish territory. You think my surname is difficult to try to pronounce in average Finnish village? So North Koreans enter into that village, not much, just, a kilometer or two maybe beyond the border. And then what? NATO reacts? Article 3, Article 5, do you see it? Are we, declaring a war on North Korea? So these kind of scenarios are the hybrid, as you would, are the most seriously considered, at least here up in the high north, because this is what we see, and we've seen already happening under different guises. The first one was obviously, there were cut satellite cables, there were weaponized migration bouts, and so on and so forth. And in many of that cases, NATO is either going to do nothing or be completely useless. So again, the question for me is, how long will we trust? And it is very useful, again, coming back to being addicted to that feeling of trust, to that feeling of security, that everything is fine because NATO, that I do wonder myself, where is that breaking point? I don't know, to be honest. I'm not going to be giving any prophecies in that regard. The just very briefly, that Europe is going to have to do something that is obvious. I was actually listening to Barry with kind of like, oh, I like when someone talks about European leaders with this admiration. We don't get that often, Barry. Just normally it's entirely different tone. I would like to believe that these people perhaps see further than the next paycheck, but I don't know, to be like, I don't know, and I can't see it in Europe's strategic documents either. And this is perhaps something that worries me the most.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Yeah, Jeremy, if again you could respond to the same thing as well. And in addition to that, whether you think
The same thing is what?
as Monica regarding that issue of trust, if I know you had mentioned that a little
Oh,
bit,
yeah.
that's
Trust
something.
I'm for it.
It's a good thing. I agree. If you think that can continue, and I guess what you think happens if that trust runs out, you think there's something like structural, systemic reasons that demand change to this relationship outside of just what is happening right now, say in Ukraine, and in the future as well.
I mean, I think I
Oops, I think we lost him. Yeah. All right. Barry, maybe
He froze.
Yeah, he's frozen. Barry, maybe we could follow up with you as well there. So let's say that on Monica's point, we don't have an invasion. You have something maybe like some type of hybrid poking at maybe the Baltic countries or something like that, or maybe you don't. But the Ukraine war comes to an end either on terms of something like a negotiated peace settlement through the Trump administration, or whatever it ends up being, it ends with Ukraine not in NATO. I suppose, how do you see the structural changes taking place from there? What happens to the alliance from that point?
Well, Ukraine wasn't in the alliance, so I actually don't really believe that anything that happens, as far as the settlement of the Ukraine war, says much of anything about NATO's credibility. Right? I think since NATO put its credibility as a friend and an ally on the line to Ukraine, I think it would be unfortunate if Ukrainian defenses simply collapsed and the Russians could march into Kyiv and dictate the terms of the Ukrainian government. I don't study the war closely enough to say with really high confidence that alternative is probably not possible for Russia at this moment, that the Ukrainians are strong enough to prevent that, right? But I don't think that a negotiated settlement has that much implication. I credit the larger argument, which is that the Russians are very truculent, and they rattle doors and they see where there's openings, and they like keeping their adversaries, or even the people who could conceivably be their adversaries, back-footed. That's what they like. I mean, I don't know whether we're going to call this a cultural trait, or we want to call it a response to their geopolitical position, or we can tell stories about where this originates, but it's not nice having them as a neighbor. But the Finns learned what it took to deal with the Russians as a neighbor, and I was laughing a little bit when she said they turned up in a Finnish village. But I used to do Northern Flank security, and I kind of know Finns. I think they turned up in a Finnish village, they get shot to death, is what happens, right? The real question is, and there's some questions about some other places they might turn up where something might happen. But Finland, I actually think that it's not a place a North Korean really wants to go if he's carrying a Kalashnikov, just to make a different, cultural observation. But the larger point, I think, is right. The Russians will be trying, rattling, whatever, and it's clear from pretty much everyone's affect towards the Ukraine war that most countries in NATO don't want to risk a nuclear war over whether or not Ukraine does or does not control Crimea. And so responses to Russian cage rattling is not going to be, I invoke Article 5, let's crank up the nuclear deterrent and fill the skies with airplanes. It's not going to, I don't think it's what's going to happen. But is that what happened in the Cold War? I mean, what did we do when the Russians invaded Czechoslovakia? Did we, get all muscular, or did we say, let's see if we can cool this thing off some way? Let's see if we can contain this thing. So I think there'll be pushback all along the way, and people will have to develop new tools to push back. And every possible tool for pushing back isn't necessarily going to be a NATO tool. This is a place where the European Union might actually be better, have more competencies, right? But living next door to Russia in its present state is not going to be fun. It's going to be a daily aggravating and risky activity. And the question that Europeans have to ask is the one that Jeremy raised at the outset, which is that, and also that I really like the analogy to the dollar, which is do you still have confidence in the full faith and credit of the U.S. Treasury? Now, gold is not really a good example. What's an example? The example is who holds what security as their reserves. And the thing that's miraculous is that people are willing to hold vast quantities of treasuries as their national financial reserves, and are still willing to do it. There isn't enough. There may not be enough gold in the world. Is this mere confidence, or is there an underlying strength? Are the indignities of having a less credible commitment so awful relative to the possibility of having no commitment, right? Of the Americans being gone, right? So, I'm babbling here, but and finance is not really my thing, but the old joke about the dollar or treasuries and everything else is that it's the prettiest cowboy at the square dance. And if not that, then what? And I think this is the question the Europeans ask themselves. If not this relationship with America, then what? And what doesn't look that great to them compared to a relationship with America, which is why they're willing to tolerate a lot of indignities to keep it going. But if, as with the dollar, if Donald Trump manages to destroy entirely the credibility of American debt, people will dump it. And the same may be true of NATO.
Thank you so much. And now that we have Jeremy back, I'd like to go to you and maybe see if you had any potential answers for that question. If not NATO, then what, from the European perspective? In regard specifically to, do you think that, besides the point that we have Europeans who like the present situation for the most part, do you think that NATO as a permanent alliance that seems to increase these various regional blocs, is it advantageous and it should continue as is, or should there be something fundamentally different?
Oh, from a European perspective, I think as we've been emphasizing, they would like it to continue as it is. The question is really, I think has been well set up here. Can it? And that does reduce to this question of trust in the U.S. support, whether it will really be there at the moment that you need it. And it seems to me that's the question we're trying to puzzle, and that is the question, frankly, in my meetings with European states people, I guess we called them, that they are trying to engage with. And as of now, particularly relative to the alternatives, they are still in the mode, as has been expressed, that they're going to do all that they can to keep it in. But they are already very worried about it. And so perhaps I have a somewhat different opinion as to what could finally undermine the full faith and credit of the U.S. security guarantee. It's true, certainly, that we have, let's say, overpredicted the decline of the dollar for roughly 60 years. And so this is a very dangerous area. But I think that the points that have been made about the lack of Russian sort of overall threat are, I think from my perspective, from a military perspective, very good ones. But from the standpoint of particularly of some governments in Europe, particularly the Polish and the Baltic state governments, they're not good arguments. And they really do, I think, genuinely believe in this threat from Russia. So they are not just passingly interested in the full faith and credit of the U.S. security guarantee. It is an absolute for them. It is an absolute existential thing. I think you're right that there are other ways that they probably shouldn't see it that way, but they do. And as I have often said in the Russian context, countries get to determine their own threat perception, and generally speaking, they tend towards paranoia, and that is what we're seeing. So in that context, um, the the I think that the way that the Trump administration handles Ukraine could potentially be the sort of currency earthquake that we're talking about for Europeans. I think if you look back to the first Trump administration, you see Europeans really thinking about it in exactly these ways and trying to prepare for the possibility of the breaking of the alliance because they were already quite nervous about it. All of that went away the minute that Joe Biden took the oath of office, and they doubled down on it going away when Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine. Um, but it is coming back. It coexists with this effort at denialism, but to the extent that Trump, particularly in Ukraine, reveals himself to be what they are afraid he is, I think they will be starting to take different measures to at least prepare hedges, which is what they were starting to do in his first term. That is, as we've discussed, a fairly long-term procedure. And so it can coexist with an effort to try to um, keep the Americans in. But I think that they will be preparing, they could soon start to be preparing these hedges. And there's a couple of different ways of thinking of what they might do, a couple of different alternatives. I sort of think of them as three canonically. The first is they could sort of Europeanize NATO, and this has already been referred to. They could sort of, take over the headquarters, get to be Sakir, and try to use the structures as they are without the Americans, and that's just a sort of convenient institutional expression because it already exists, because the Americans probably won't get in the way, because it has already that good brand name. This is a little bit like that Baby Bell taking over AT&T and then renaming itself to AT&T, and then eventually everyone ever forgot that it wasn't that actually that's not AT&T. This is probably too complicated a corporate history, but trust me on this. And so that's one way. The other way is the EU. The EU looks phenomenally unpromising at this point because it's such a confusing organization. It has a bunch of recalcitrant members and no process for overriding them. And none of the major powers really seem to trust it or want to concede more sovereignty to it. And then the third option is a sort of mini-lateral effort of various groupings, or perhaps overlapping, which strikes me as probably the most promising. And this could feature around a sort of Weimar Triangle, potentially Poland, France, Germany. That doesn't look great at the moment, but in a year or two, possibly it could look a little bit better. They could bring in the UK, or there's other potential groupings. Nordic Baltic is something that is mentioned. So, and given that the Russian threat isn't what it's often stacked up to be, some of these groupings could individually be quite effective for the security problems that these countries believe they have. So, I think that I think they have the potential, if Trump is obnoxious enough, particularly in the Ukraine environment, to start to move toward these things. And I don't think that that is inconsistent with them continuing to try to keep the Americans in. And I don't think it's inconsistent with them experimenting along all three of these lines of sort of institutional expression of their effort to work together on security.
Excellent. Thank you. So, Chris, I'd like to hear what you have to say about that. I know you've thought about NATO as less than an ideal organization, obviously, for not only European security, or maybe world security is more accurate. So what do you think, especially as the American people seem to increasingly agree with the Mearsheiman point, improper pronunciation, but the point that NATO's very presence in the world is escalatory and contrary to global security. So what do you think? Do you think that there are some type of different options besides NATO or one of those three that Jeremy just offered? Which of those would be most likely from your viewpoint?
Yeah, I think the third option that Jeremy talked about has a lot of promise. My personal view actually isn't necessarily, as we rightly have said in this discussion, that NATO is not its own thing, right? It's an assemblage, if you will. It fits into a philosophical definition of assemblage theory. It is made up of its constituent parts, and its biggest part is the United States. And my concern with NATO isn't that there's an alliance that exists between these countries. It's yes, how the alliance has been used in the post-Cold War world, but also that it is, like I said, the tip of the spear of the United States, and it is. I think that NATO makes perfect sense for European countries. I have no objection to European countries having a pan-European alliance. I think that's a great check on Russia. It's good for the balance of power of the world. I just think it's hard to reconcile this with the U.S., which has much more global interests than most European countries. And I think that the U.S., a rational self-conception of U.S. interest is going to be one that prioritizes the Western Hemisphere and the overall global balance of power, and deprioritizes things that don't directly tie into those things. And I these days, Europe isn't on the world stage the center point that it used to be 100 years ago. So some degree of the U.S. perhaps it remains as a logistical coordinator, partners with intelligence, but being the primary mover of European politics, I find this both distorting to the American national interest and, to echo Monica's point, I think in the long term distorting to many European national interests as well. This doesn't mean that we can't be friends, it's just an understanding of prioritization. And I think the issue that would most concern me in all of this is that a very likely possibility for the end of the quote unquote end of the Ukraine war is not a peace deal, or at least a peace deal that is recognized by anyone, especially if it involves territorial annexation. No one wants to be on the line signing off for that, right? I think it's very likely that we're going to see a Korean DMZ style thing where there is a ceasefire and no peace deal. And this would be in a country that is very large and very flat, so very different from the Korean Peninsula here. A very, very long, fortified border in what is legally contested territory, internationally speaking. And who knows how long that situation will be there for. Obviously, the Korean DMZ situation has lasted a very long time, right? That would be a huge, if the US was heavily involved in this would be a huge drain in resources for the US position overall. And it also would be a huge problem in European politics. It would be a potential flashpoint for who knows how long, and the number one security concern for the countries that border Ukraine. So that would be my primary concern, and that's what I worry about when we talk about these things. So I would like to see. I have no problem with these regional alliance networks. I just want them to be more regional, and therefore, European Security Pact. That's great. There's an Asian Security Pact. That's fine. How much role the U.S. has in either one, that's up for debate, including myself. I don't have a concrete position on that, but I would just like to see more flexibility and less rigidity, and I think that means giving up the attempt by the U.S. mostly to kind of run everything through its own view of permanent locked-in alliance networks.
Excellent, thank you. Monica, I'd like to know if you agree with that as well. Do you think the regionalization, like Chris is discussing, is preferable to the current order right now, the current state of affairs? Would this contribute to more long-term stability if the United States did indeed have a much reduced role within NATO and try to maybe move away from something like this containment mindset that seems inherent to its involvement?
But I see two problems here. not necessarily two solutions, though. The first one is that those countries that are genuinely concerned with Russia, the ones that Barry described, most of them, maybe with the exception of Poland, are geopolitical bump stops. I mean, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, if you can find them on a map, in terms of capacities and defense capabilities, are not exactly intimidating, are they? But they are the ones that need NATO the most. And so that's the first problem. What kind of unilateral coalitions are we talking about? And on what kind of foundation? And the second one is that if we were to pursue this avenue, then it seems that from this foundational Americans in, Russians out, we would have to resign from Germans down, yeah, because we would go with the biggest powers. And Germans not down in Europe, well, will that go with everyone? Now we tend, well, I guess Europeans are not only good in buck passing, but also in keeping ourselves in this Kantian garden where everything is nice and dandy and we're all friends. But it does also require a lot of deluding ourselves that we are all equals. So giving precedence and suddenly creating priorities. Now that goes firstly against European founding myth, and then secondly against NATO founding myth. Now, that takes a lot of myth busting, if you ask me. I'm not saying it's not a viable policy option. I'm just saying it's a very brave, a courageous policy option. And as a footnote only, if you remember what happened in the previous Trump presidency, was that in Poland tried to make Fort Trump in Poland. And that was a very neat and also very cool way of anchoring American presence that was tied personally to the Grand Emperor. So I thought that was a neat thing to do. And to be honest, I'm not really that sure it's going to work this time, even if it was tried. So I am full of question marks. I'm sorry, Dominic, here.
No, thank you so much. I think we all are. So I believe we're coming to our end here. I'd like to ask one more question specifically to Barry, but then if anybody else would like to contribute as well. It's touching on what Monica just said, when you have this wide discrepancy in defense needs on the European continent between its countries, something like the Baltics versus those further west. Do you see any type of actual change, any type of regional structure arising, or is the most likely option that the status quo continues and that, maybe we see a little bit pushback here and there, but there's this bipartisan consensus maybe within the establishment that maybe stymies some of the more adventurous, or not adventurous, but rather reforming initiatives that the Trump administration would want to implement. So basically, do things just most likely continue as is? What did the next 4 years look like? I know we talked about how we don't want to predict things, but just intuitively, does it seem like through sheer inertia we continue as we have continued in the past, or is there something different on the horizon?
Well, this is the question we've been talking about all the hours, so I have really nothing Solomonic to say about it. The only thing I would say is that the small and medium countries who have signed up with the West, but who live on the borders of Russia, are a hawkish and America-loving lobby inside NATO and the European Union. But the problem is that the same thing that makes them that way gives them not much power. And the way they try to achieve their interests is by being extremely active in Washington, diplomatically and politically. And the question and the argument they've always made, I think, is basically a liberal international kind of argument. And that argument has worked, and it even worked to build a constituency to bring Ukraine into NATO. That's an argument that I don't think works with the Trump administration. So then the question is, do these countries, can they find a new argument that's going to not only win them some friends in Washington, but the right friends, friends who can resonate? And I'm not sure exactly what they have to put on the table. They had a nice ideological story to put on the table in the past. That is waning in its utility. So you have a hawkish lobby without many cards to play, and I don't know how it's going to sort itself out, but it is going to be something to watch.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I believe that pretty much takes us to the end of our webinar here. I'd like to thank all our panelists. It's been excellent, very informative, and again, at a very interesting time in world affairs. So I'd like to remind everybody that this live stream will be on YouTube. You can find it either at the IPD website or through IPD's YouTube channel or Twitter. So thank you again to everybody, and best regards.
Thank you. I'm sure we will all be in for a very interesting anthropological experiment when Annalena Baerbock and Trump meet in person in the near future.
There we go. Thanks, guys. Bye, everybody.
Thank you for having me. Have a good day.
Monica.